Welcome, everyone. My name is Kyung Lee, and my pronouns are she and her. I work as the Assistant Director of International Programs at the University of Pittsburgh, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Hasselbein Global Academy Virtual Summit session entitled Leading a Recession-Proof Organizations. Please note that this session is being recorded. Our presenter for this session is Max Polec. Max is an alum from the Hasselbein Global Academy class of 2015 and a graduate of the University of Pittsburgh. With over a decade of startup experience, Max observes the intersection of leadership and business. Currently, Max is the founder of Abstract Collective, a full-service studio focused on marketing, design, and strategy to help organizations build their brand and grow. Max is also editor-in-chief for the CEO Strategy, a website dedicated to sharing business strategy articles that are worth your time. Max is based in Austin, Texas. Thank you, Max, for being with us today, and let's go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the great introduction. Very excited to be here with everybody, and we'll hop right into the presentation. So what I'll be speaking about today is leading a recession-proof organization. So before we hop into the actual meat of the presentation, I want to walk through an agenda to kind of highlight what you can expect to hear about through this workshop. So first, we'll break down that understanding that uncertainty is a constant, but it can be managed. We'll discuss tactics to build a recession-proof organization and understand the three key survival levers that come into play during a recession: raising outside investment, cutting costs, and growing revenue, along with planning for uncertainty using scenario planning, and then leading with the heart when making tough decisions. I'll also have plenty of time at the end for question and answer. So as you have questions pop up during the presentation, feel free to put that into the Zoom chat. And of course, we'll have time allocated at the end to be able to answer those questions that you all have. Some other things that I'll mention briefly about myself. So as y'all know, I'm a Pitt alum. I went through Hasselbein back in 2015. My day-to-day is doing a lot of consulting around marketing, design, and strategy. The CEO Strategy website is actually going to be launching later this quarter. And other stuff is, I have hobbies such as woodworking. I've been doing that for 5+ years. Reading, if you have a good book, let me know. And I also love doing travel. And even though I'm based in Austin, I'm actually calling from Philadelphia. I'm visiting family this time of the year. So I'm super excited to be able to present to you all and to be here with everybody. So the first topic that I want to break down is understanding that uncertainty is constant, but it can be managed. So what I want to discuss is, we want to really figure out what are we assuming about our business, about our organization, that if wrong could jeopardize what we do. A really good framework to use here is the risky assumption framework to really dissect what are the things that we're assuming and how dangerous could those assumptions be if they are wrong. Some assumptions that you might have about your organization could be: we have product market fit if you're an early stage startup. Our customers will never leave us, or our donors will never stop supporting us if you're either a company or nonprofit organization, or we'll have a successful product launch or a successful fundraiser at the end of the year. The to-do item or the action item here is to create a list of risky assumptions that you and your team have about your organization and take that into the next step. The next step being understanding that what gets measured gets done. This is what gets measured gets managed by Peter Drucker. And what you want to do with that list of risky assumptions you have is really break down and ask yourself, how can we measure and how can we track these? For example, if you have a goal to raise $1 million over the course of 1 year, and let's just say it's 12 months to make it easy, you want to make sure that you're breaking that up into shorter segments, maybe something like 1 month, so you can do regular check-ins across the short term to make sure that you and your team are on track to reaching that goal. Or if you find 3, 6, 9 months in that you're not, you're able to be proactive and pivot and adapt your strategy earlier, as opposed to waiting until the end of the year, the end of the 12 months, and saying, oh, we really missed our mark. Another action item, once you know what your assumptions are, how to measure them, is putting together an uncertainty task force. So you have the list of risky assumptions and you've organized them in such a way that you can measure them. Now you want to be able to identify who needs to be on this task force and how often you need to check in with this task force. The frequency will typically depend on the specific scenario, your organization, and the risks that you're measuring. But typically monthly is a good go-to to start up. And depending on how risky your assumptions are, you might shift that to quarterly, or if you're in a crisis or in a recession, you might have these meetings more frequently, once a week or even more often. Breaking this down and really analyzing what this looks like in practice, this is a quick and simple chart to be able to assess a couple assumptions and how we might dissect them. So we have the assumption itself, how we measure the assumption, the check-in frequency, and then of course a clear owner for managing this risk, managing this assumption. So for the first one, let's assume that we can secure $1 million in sales over the next 6 months. How do we measure this? We measure this by breaking this down month by month and saying if we want to make $1 million in 6 months, we want to have at least an average of around $167,000 per month. And hopefully this is increasing month over month. The reason why we want to be increasing is we want to make sure that we are growing our organization, growing our business, and that we're working in the right direction. Check-in frequency could be once a month, and this fits really nicely into, say, the ownership of your VP of sales, your vice president of sales, or whoever you have that manages sales on your team. And this could be a document such as a monthly revenue retrospective or a monthly look back, basically saying, here was what we projected to make, here's what we actually made, and here's how far above or below we were, and here's what we can learn from the previous month of sales data and things along that nature. So you can see here, it's clear what the assumption is, how we measure it, when we're checking in, and who is owning, managing this assumption, managing this risk. For the second assumption, we could say we want to have a new product launch in 3 months, and we want that to be a success. Again, how do we measure this? We could say that we want to have roughly $50,000 in pre-sales or pre-orders, and let's say $250,000 in sales 30 days after launch. Since this is a more timely and a more pressing and potentially more exciting assumption we have, the check-in frequency might make sense to do it more often, let's say once a week. And since we really have two main themes or assumptions to manage here, it's one, can we create the product? And two, can we generate demand and sales around the product? You probably will have two different owners, but those owners having very specific pieces to manage. For example, for the product, you might have the engineering director lead the progress check on development of the product, making sure it's ready to go, making sure it's created before the deadline and things like that. And a tactical document you could create is anything from a weekly update sync or a Gantt chart to really measure and track, are we ahead of schedule? Are we behind schedule? Or are we right on the timeline? And then on the generating demand for the product with the pre-sales and with the sales after launch, you might hand this over to your chief marketing officer, right? Building together a marketing plan and ironing out what needs to be executed when, so that we both build awareness, demand around the product to generate those pre-orders before launch. And of course, make sure we have a successful launch and generate a lot of sales after the product has been launched itself. So again, this is really tying in together a lot of those themes around understanding that uncertainty is constant, but it can be managed. Moving into the next topic I want to cover, I want to dissect a couple of different tactics to build a recession-proof organization. The first one, and I think this is where everyone should start, is knowing your numbers. So what do I mean when I say know your numbers? All organizations, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, operate in relation to their financials. Your financials allow you to launch new products, host events, grow your team, hire vendors, and do other activities that will either maximize your revenue, maximize your impact, maximize your growth, et cetera, et cetera. Too often, we lose track of our numbers and we don't keep a close eye on them. And we lose track of how much we're spending per month, or in other words, our burn versus how much money we're bringing in per month, or in other words, our revenue. It's good practice to keep a steady pulse on your numbers and have whoever is your head of finance, your financial lead, keep track of this and make sure that this information is shared across the team. However, if you've fallen out of habit or you're worried about a potential recession in the future, putting together a profit and loss statement covering at least the previous 6 to 12 months of financial data is a really good way to get a really good specific idea on your organization's financial health and to see what trends you can find. Are you making more money month over month? Are your costs too high? Are you just right? And really being able to get a good foundation for where your business is or where your organization is at that moment of time, and do some predictions around how you might handle a crisis, a recession, or a event that might be coming up. Next, we want to build our organization for succession, right? And this is basically keeping your organizational house in order. So for example, if your organization is a for-profit business, this means that you probably have the end goal of selling the business one day and having that exit event happen. But even if you're running a nonprofit, this means that you want to build your organization in such a way that you could pass it on to the future leadership so they can succeed you and have the same and hopefully more impact with the organization and being able to grow its organization and grow its impact. Some key questions to ask yourself and to keep in mind when you're thinking about, are we building for succession? Are we building for passing on leadership to the next generation? Are, does your organization have clear processes that are repeatable at a certain level of scale? Do you have an organizational handbook that runs through key activities for your organization, the key activities that you need to do to launch product, grow revenue, gain new donors, maximize impact, et cetera, et cetera? If you could no longer run your organization tomorrow, would your organization still be able to operate? Do you have someone who can fit in the short term? Do you have a succession plan over the long term? Are you interested in your team? Are you investing in your team to upskill them so that they can grow long term with your organization and grow into those leadership roles of the future? And then lastly, is your product portfolio, particularly if you're a for-profit organization, strong, or is it in need of some type of work? Oftentimes we'll find product companies that need to either reassess or renew or kind of rebuild out their product line to be more in common with what consumers and customers are looking for. So these are a lot of different key questions to ask when you're thinking about, am I building my organization to be built for succession? Next, you want to be able to assess your organization every quarter for risk factors. There's a parable and a story that goes something along the lines of, if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll instantly leap out. However, if you put the frog in water that's probably pleasingly, tepid, not too hot, not too cold, and you gradually heat it, the frog will remain there until it boils to death. So what the main takeaway here is, you want to get in the habit of doing a pulse check on your organization at least once a quarter. Again, you might do it more frequently if you're in a crisis or in a recession, but you want to get into the habit of doing it at least on a regular basis and not waiting until some kind of macro level event, such as a economic downturn, to find out all the problems that have been festering in your organization and that should have been dealt with at an earlier time. Now I'm going to go through the 3 key survival levers during a recession, and a lot of this will make sense for-profit entities, typically startups, to keep in mind. So these are 3 levers to keep in mind during a recession. The first one is raising money. So you want to be able to, again, go back to knowing your numbers and doing a trajectory from now to 24 months out and ask yourself, are we going to be able to still have our organization be alive if we're under the same or worsening conditions? And basically it's answering the question of, are you default dead or are you default alive? Default alive being, if we assume with our current growth rates 24 months out that it's either the same or worsening conditions, we'll be able to weather that storm. Default dead is, under the same or worsening conditions, we're not going to have the financials, we're not going to be able to make it, we'll probably have to shut down. If the answer is no, and you're a startup or you're an early stage company, typically looking to raise outside investment capital is a really good option to look into. Again, giving some additional equity or ownership in the business away in order to take some capital in to be able to increase your chances of surviving a recession is oftentimes well worth looking into and well worth exploring. Another piece is cutting costs. So again, when you know your numbers, when you have that profit and loss statement, you can go back and look at every single line item that you have under the cost and ask yourself a few questions, right? Where is your biggest source of spend coming from? What are your recurring expenses? And how can you get creative about managing your expenses, whether that's selecting a lower paid tier on, say, software that you use, or exploring a payment plan with some vendors that you have, and really getting creative about how can we cut unnecessary costs, how can we minimize costs that we're only spending money on the essential. Keep in mind that with this, everything is negotiable, and you'll be surprised when the time comes about how providers and vendors are more than willing to work with you because they want to be able to be a partner with your organization over the long term. The third lever is to increase revenue, right? So similar to how we're doing these different audits and we're looking at our numbers and we're looking at the assumptions we have, really do an audit of your sales strategy, or if you're a nonprofit, your donor strategy, and review every single tactic that you do and try to figure out what is still working, what is leading to the highest return on investment, and can you be more aggressive with winning sales tactics in order to increase revenue now in the short term and hopefully across the long term. And really finding a good balance of these three levers is really important, and it really helps make a big difference. Again, raising money, cutting costs, and increasing revenue. And a lot of these tactics are relatively not too new either. I actually worked with a biotech startup based in the southeastern part of the United States in 2020, where they were spending upwards of $80,000 a month. They were not generating the revenue that they needed, and they were not in a good position financially to be able to weather the storm that COVID caused to the economy. So what I was able to help them do is, again, raising money. We raised $300,000 in bridge financing to give them a little bit more of a runway for their organization. We were able to cut their costs from $80,000 to $30,000, really looking at what was things that we could do without and negotiating everything else. And then we were able to put some sales experiments in place to be able to grow their revenue and make it easier to be able to weather that storm in that case. So these are three levers that any organization can apply and can explore, but particularly if you're a for-profit organization, it's worth kind of dissecting each of these three to make a plan, to make a strategy for how to lead your organization through a recession. Next, I'm going to break down what scenario planning is and how we can use that to be able to manage uncertainty. So scenario planning is basically the idea of making assumptions about your organization's future and the environment that you may find yourself in. These typically can be generalized to one of three scenarios. You have the best case, the middle case, and the worst case. And this can also be very specific, whether it's monitoring a certain trend, a certain decision, or a certain sales goal. And the goal here is that you want to be able to branch out what are the different scenarios that can occur, and at least draft your response, or at least draft your action items, your responses, if they were to occur. The more detail you have here, the better. And I like this because you're able to be proactive about what might happen and be able to plan strategically before it does happen and before you're battling kind of the emotions that come with finding yourself in a recession, or finding yourself in crisis. For example, breaking down scenario planning, you might ask yourself, hey, if the product flopped and we sold very little or none of it, what's our course of action? How do we minimize the costs? How do we minimize the losses here? Or on the best case, if it was good, what if it wasn't just good, it was great, and your team is now struggling to keep up with the demand of the success? You're not able to ship orders on time. What is your response there and stuff like that? So really being able to ask yourself, hey, we're worried about these risky assumptions. We know this information based off of the audits we've been able to put together and knowing our numbers. What are the different scenarios that could happen, and how are we as a leader going to respond to these and think proactively about what may happen so we're prepared for any scenario that might come our way? Next, I want to break down kind of the intersection of leadership here. So leading with the heart when making tough decisions. This is a really good script to be able to use when communicating with your team. I'm a big fan of being honest and communicating with your team early and often, whether you're dealing with a problem, a crisis, a recession, or whatever it might be. And typically the script is, this is the problem, here is what we're doing to address it, and here is what you need to know. And this is very important because you want to be able to share this with your team. And bonus points if you use the script and also include, when they can expect to hear a next update about the problem, about the crisis that your organization is dealing with, and then also give them a place to go to have their questions. Because typically what you'll find is whether it's a problem, a crisis, or whatever it might be, The team will need some time to process the information. They'll have questions. And of course, they're going to want to say, when are we going to get another update with more new or more relevant information? And the thing that I always push a lot of the founders and a lot of the leaders that I work with is really breaking down this question of, would they rather be the leader who was honest with their team and who communicated with their team to find that collaborative success, to overcome a roadblock, to overcome a problem, to overcome a crisis, or be the leader that didn't share it with their team, put the burden entirely on themselves, and ultimately ended up blindsiding their team when the strategy didn't work out? So it's very important, again, to lead with the heart and to be able to communicate and share with your team, we're in crisis, we're running into a roadblock, we have a problem, and here's what we're doing, and here's what you need to know. Layoffs is a big thing that's considered, and you don't have to do too many Google searches to find a lot of layoffs happening, particularly in the tech industry across the United States right now. I'm a firm believer that this should be the last thing you consider as a leader. Some things to keep in mind with this is you want to cut costs when you do the know your numbers audit. You want to understand where your costs are, and you want to be able to cut wherever else possible, right? If you are paying a X amount in rent, you want to be able to call whoever is leasing the office space and say, hey, can we do X minus Y, and see if you're able to negotiate that. Same thing for vendors, same thing for softwares and things like that. You really want to try to cut your costs everywhere else first before you look into the human capital piece of your cost structure. Other levers that you have when it comes to getting creative here is doing salary freezes, basically saying what everyone on the team is making is going to be frozen at that level until we navigate and get into clearer waters. And that typically helps with just managing, your human capital, making sure that cost doesn't go up higher over time. Another thing is doing a hiring freeze. So if you're unsure about what the climate might be in the economy, pausing and saying, we're not going to hire anybody new yet until we have a clearer picture of what the economy might look like, what the recession might look like moving forward. And another thing that you can do, particularly if you're an early stage company, since a lot of companies will do a compensation package that includes some kind of equity share as well, and equity is basically ownership in the business, is you could work with your employees to offer, and the key word here is to offer them to be able to trade salary in for equity. So someone might be making, $80,000, and they might say, hey, I only need $50,000. I'll take that trade and make less, but I'll have a larger ownership share in the company. And that helps because you have less money you're spending on human resources, on the people that are making your organization great, and that they're also vested in on the long term, because if they have more equity, they want to be able to see the organization, the startup succeed, so that when there is that exit event, they're able to make more money on the back end since they have more ownership in the company. If you do need to lay off people, the thing I always tell everybody is you want to give them as much notice as possible. And again, this comes back to communicating early and often, and really just thinking about how can you support them as much as possible in that offboarding and even in that post organization process. This could be writing recommendations. This could be giving endorsements. This could be making introductions to organizations that that are hiring, because we do so much as leaders to make sure that people have a fantastic onboarding experience. And I always try to get leaders to think about how can they make their offboarding experience as good, if not better, because you really want to make sure that you try to have that experience be as good, as great as possible throughout the entire life cycle of having somebody on your team. And of course, above all else, we want to make sure that you are being human and that you're being compassionate with everybody that you're working with and with everybody that you're leading. Now I'm going to shift over to question and answer and see what questions y'all have that I can help provide some answers to. And if you have any questions, feel free to put that in the Zoom chat and I'll be able to answer those for you. I'll give you all some time to think that over. And what I'll do in the interim is I'll actually shift over to my last slide, which is sharing a bonus resource. So like I mentioned at the top of the call, I've been doing a lot of recession strategy sessions with organizations as we try to figure out what the flavor, what the recession that we're going to be entering will look like moving forward, whether it's going to be something that's a year and a half or 2 years. So if any of y'all are leaders trying to figure out how can I navigate my organization through the recession, I'm more than happy to be able to meet with you and meet with your team to run through this presentation and have a dialogue around really understanding where are your organization's risk factors, what needs to be thought through and strategized around, and how can we make sure that we're prepared as possible for the recession. So that's a resource that I have. The other thing that I'll share, and this is in the slideshow notes, is just 2 years ago during COVID, I did a joint webinar series called Crisis Response. And during that time, we were talking a lot with for-profit startup leaders to be able to dissect, what are previous crises or economic downturns that they were able to be in, and really break down what were their lessons, their strategies, and their tactics. And I have two linked, one with Greg Katike, who really breaks down his experience navigating a for-profit entity in that he was building in the software industry. And then I also have a second one where we have Alana and Afshan, who talk about the same kind of playbook, strategies, lessons, and tactics, and break that down for if you're building a physical product or a piece of hardware. So those are additional resources to share as well. And I do see some activity in the chat. So what could be some alternatives in measuring the results besides numbers? I always try to be as quantifiable as possible with numbers, because that's something that's more objective to measure, but you can also look into things such as, customer sentiment or donor sentiment. You could do social shares, NPS scores come to mind, net promoter scores come to mind, but it's really trying to figure out, for every, whether it's a goal or whether it's a risk that you have, figuring out what's the key metric that you want to measure in some way and find a way to be able to reliably keep a good pulse on that. I have the bias, having built my career in startups and business, with trying to quantify it to a number that we can track, but there's other ways that we can get a little bit more creative with that, particularly when we look for more qualitative data. And that could be stuff, like I said, NPS scores, surveys, and things of that nature. But that's a great question, and thank you for asking that. Shifting over to the, thank you so much. Shifting over to the next question. My product family table time is as the best time now post-COVID. How do I go back to people I contacted pre-COVID? Can the person who asked that question offer a little bit more context there?
It's me, it's Neil. And I met with Frances back in her late 90s, and we created a model for creating the To-Be family. And I went out right prior to COVID and went to a bunch of people that were supporters, people potentially funders. But when COVID hit, they got alligator hands for all the things that I wanted them to be involved with my product and program. But now, I'm just going to say it plain, with some of the craziness that's been going on with the mass shootings and everything else, and coming out of COVID, people have told me, you need to go back to all the people you reached out beforehand, because your product to connect families in a communicative way around the dinner table is more powerful now than ever before. So I'm going to shut up and listen.
No, I love that. And first off, thank you for the product that you're creating. It sounds incredible, and I'll have to check it out myself. What I would do if I were in your shoes, and I'm going to put my investor hat on, there's this theme that comes up with, how do we talk with investors, people that might be able to fundraise for and donate towards our cause. And the theme that comes to mind is investors invest in lines, not dots. And if you think about it, every interaction you have with an investor is kind of a dot on a graph. And what you want to be able to signal and communicate is, hey, we're finding traction, we have growing interest. And depending on what state your product is, that might be with, hey, our sales are growing, we're making more sales month over month, and that's at an increasing rate. Or we have early customers who are using this, and here's some testimonials about what they have to say about how it's been able to bring their family together, how they've been able to have crucial conversations, and things like that. So when it comes to the communication strategy of reaching out to those previous people you had conversations with probably in 2019, maybe early 2020, I think it's, sending an email and saying something along the lines of, hey, I know we talked a couple years ago, pre-COVID, and obviously now we're in a more safe environment now in regards to COVID. I'd love to be able to update you on some things that have happened, right? And here are some testimonials, here's some metrics around our revenue, here's what the product's looking like. Maybe you were, still developing the product and now it's created, and really being able to signal that there's a sense of excitement around what you're creating and that there's a sense of traction, that since you last talked with them, you've been able to find some kind of growth. Again, that could be quantifiable with revenue, that could also be qualifiable or qualitative, I should say, with testimonials and what people are saying about the product that you're creating. So that's the angle that I would go at with about re-engaging investors you talked with, a couple of years ago.
I used to work for McDonald's Corporation, and the head trainer for all the Ronald McDonald's around the world, he would give not a one thumb, but a two thumber. That was a two thumber response. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you so much. Great question. And please, everybody else, if you have any questions around anything that was covered, please don't hesitate to put it into the chat, because we covered a lot of different frameworks and a lot of ways to be able to dissect, how to build a recession-proof organization. So please don't hesitate to put questions that you'll have. The things I'll kind of riff on in the meantime as we wait for a few more questions, the big takeaways that I would say is, you want to be as, thank you. You want to be as proactive as possible. So you'll see that a lot of what I'm putting into this presentation is trying to think ahead and saying, what are some assumptions we have that we need to monitor? Or what are some problems that might turn into roadblocks and crises that we need to be more proactive about handling and stuff like that. So that's a big theme and a big takeaway to take from this presentation. The other thing is just putting in the proper processes. So, I mentioned with, the knowing your numbers and the risk task force, it's really making sure that you know what it is that needs to be managed and that you have some kind of recurring meeting. Again, things might be incredible, there might be very little risk, and maybe you just meet once a quarter just to check in on that. Or maybe there's some pressing issues, maybe it's a recession and you meet once a month or once a week. Putting in those processes will help you and your organization stay on top of new information and be able to manage, again, problems before they turn into crises and things of that nature. So that's a couple of the big takeaways to think about with this, because all too often I find, an organizational leader that, hasn't been through a tough recession or through a tough event, and they're trying to figure out, hey, not only one, how can I help alleviate this issue, but two, how can I make sure that I prevent these moving forward? So there's a lot to be able to think about there along that topic, along those themes. Awesome. And again, if anyone has follow-up questions, don't be shy. More than happy to offer some input.
Can I do it online or just in video versus typing it in? It takes me a long time.
Of course.
Right. So I now have a research university in Texas, University of Texas Medical, that is interested in doing not only research for my product, but also using federal grants. I think it's STTR.
Yep.
It's grants that could potentially help build the app that I'm looking to build. I already have a prototype. And navigating through that whole process of working with a university research partner, going into using this federal grant programming is really foreign to me, new to me. So any thoughts on that, how to work with that environment?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. So a few years ago, I used to work at a university. It was actually the University of Alabama at Birmingham, in a role where I was tied to tech transfer. And one of the things that we would help with is researchers getting SBIR grants or researchers plus startups getting STTR grants. And it's a very complicated process and a lot of paperwork. But if I were in your shoes, I think since you have that researcher partner that you identified at that Texas-based university is, I would try to talk to them or see if they can connect you with somebody either in their research development team or in their tech transfer office who might be able to offer some resources around, wrapping your head around what is an STTR, what's important to keep in mind, and things like that. The other thing that I'll do a lot about is I'll do a lot of Google searching just to see what kind of, articles or how-tos I can find and stuff like that. And I'll also make a note on my side to follow up and see if I could dig up some guides around, how to apply and how to use STTR grants. So I'll make sure I jot that down on my side as well. But it's great that you have interest from that university and that you're exploring that as a funding option, because I know a lot of products that are kind of iterating upon what they want to be and what impact they can have that explore those types of grants to be able to get some initial funding to build the prototype, to build the mock-up, and get closer to having that final product.
Thank you. And I look forward to doing the free recession strategy session with you.
Of course, of course. What I will do is, I just realized I forgot to put my email on the presentation itself. So that is my email. I just put that into the chat. And again, that free recession strategy is open to anybody. And if you think that you might find somebody that would find help or benefit in this, please feel free to forward it as well. But feel free to reach out to me if this resonated with you, if you're interested in that strategy session, or if you have an organization that you think might be able to benefit from that. All of that is free. And I did that on purpose because I want to make sure that I support people who are trying to figure out, what's going on and how to navigate the uncertain waters that a lot of us are finding ourselves in, given the recession and everything going on nowadays. Awesome. And we have, I think, a few more minutes if anyone has any final questions. But again, I want to thank y'all for being able to hop on and join. It's been fantastic to be able to share with everyone who attended. And I was super excited about this and super excited to be here with y'all.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great presentation. So we'd like to thank Max for presenting this morning. Thank you as well to all of the participants who have joined us today. At the conclusion of the summit, you will receive an email with a link to a survey. We ask that you please complete the survey at your earliest convenience to share some feedback about your learning experience today. At this time, we encourage you to transition to your next session using the Zoom link, which we're located in the summit program. Thank you very much, all. Thank you very much, Max, and hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Awesome. Take care, everybody.